Good afternoon. My name is Pete Tseronis, and I'm super excited here to be with my colleagues Mike Brozek from Anterix and Matt Bult from Evergy, a utility in our country that's helping power our grid and our homes. And we're going to spend the next hour or so hoping to educate and inform and enlighten you a bit on the grid, modernization, the utility sector, specifically what it's like to adopt new technologies, how to secure those technologies and communications in a world that's evolving into one that relies on distributed energy, relies on a network that's been around for 100 years. And again, you couldn't get any more educated by practitioners such as Matt and Mike here. It's an honor to be on this webcast with these two gentlemen. And without reading their bios, I just wanted to give each of a shout out to both of you. Mike Brozek, who works with Anterix, can tell you a little bit about that role, but I've known Mike for a while now. He's got decades of experience working in that utility sector that, maybe to a lot of people is not too well known, but after today, you're going to get a sense of what that's like and its complexity, and now working in the commercial side to help secure a lot of that utility environment. Mike is an expert in that space. Matt Bult, I had the pleasure of serving on a panel with a year ago at an energy conference in Denver, and he enlightened his audience there on the power of technology and the information technology domain converged with the operational technology domain, or for those guys like myself who need it broken down, the OT, IT intersection and convergence. Matt is an expert in this space. So we'll jump around a bit, but it's three guys having a cup of coffee, the industry insights, the grid of the future. Thank you to Anterix for sponsoring this opportunity to share some of this collective wisdom. And I might even add a few pieces of flavor myself. I served in the Department of Energy as the Chief Technology Officer, and I find a role of storytelling, seeking and solving opportunities to solve grand challenges, a passion, and we'll talk a bit about that today. So without further ado, Mike Brozek, why don't you give us a little more background on your journey, your passion, and what you like to get through today, by the end of the call here.
Okay. Hey, Pete, I am super excited to join you and Matt today on this call talking about these important items. I'm Mike Brozek. I'm the VP of Technology and Engineering with Anterix. Prior to that, I spent 30 years in the electric utility industry. And when I think about it, grid modernization has been going on for a long time in the utility industry. Clear back in 1989, when I began my career, I was brought in when electromechanical devices in the substations were being replaced with microprocessor-based devices. And, to just give kind of a modern example of what that's like, I think about a traditional doorbell on your house. It's a simple switch. You push the button, the circuit is made up and the bell rings. But if you look at today's modern doorbells, like the Ring doorbell and other similar solutions to it, you've got a camera, you've got motion sensors, you've got the ability to speak through that doorbell. There's just tremendous opportunities that come along with it. It still serves its original purpose, but now it has so much more. And that was really at the beginning of my career, what we saw was just the amount of information and data. And I look forward to talking to Matt to seeing how over all of this time, this is just repeated over and over again. Systems get taken out, new ones put in, and you just have so much more information. So after my 30 years, I had an opportunity to go to work with Anterix. And Anterix is working with critical infrastructure providers like utilities to really power their systems through private LTE. And what private LTE is, well, LTE we're all very familiar with. We see it all the time on our phones. It's a global technology. It's a global standard, huge ecosystem of devices. And so utilities are looking to collapse a lot of their legacy wireless networks, and also as this age of the industrial Internet of Things is upon us, so many devices that need to be communicated with. And LTE networks are really a great choice for that. The private portion of it is really what's most important. And for a long time, utilities have been deploying private fiber and microwave networks. So I'm going to leave it there. We're super excited to talk with industry experts like Matt and yourself, Pete, and it's going to be a good webinar.
Well, thank you, Mike. And again, for our audience, this topic is in constant evolution, the grid of the future, grid modernization. You'll hear terms cyber physical systems. You're going to hopefully learn how old this network of networks, arguably the most powerful network in our country that we rely on each and every day. And I failed to mention at the beginning, but just again, as part of that educational component, my colleagues here and I always talk about if everybody in the country, if not the world, but in this case in our country, knew that the energy sector is one of 16 that are deemed most critical. If there was an outage, in other words, bad things generally would happen. And that's not including something that, you know, might be an act of God. But think about throughout this discussion about the word resilience, critical, infrastructure. And when we may mention things like smart meters, Internet of Things, Mike's going to talk a bit about his industrial Internet of Things CRADA he's working on, which is a cooperative research and development agreement. Matt's going to talk a bit about new technology and innovation in a world where some people are like, we don't want to be the game changer. We don't want to be the early adopter. Well, folks, the train left the station. We've been investing billions in this thing called the power grid, and we need to extract as much insightful information on the hygiene of this network that we deem obviously one of the most critical pieces of networking infrastructure in the world. So with that, Matt Bult, you know, Senior Manager, Ops Technology, Evergy, thought leader, change agent, super smart. Give a little bit of background, feel free to brag.
All right, well, thanks. That's a great intro. I mean, I've been engaged in people and technology since I started in the utilities. Technology is always part of change, whether it's what's forcing us to change or enabling us to execute that change quicker, right? I mean, like Pete said, in my role at Evergy, I get to help build that relationship between tech and then how our folks leverage it. You know, right now our industry is changing with projects ranging from what Mike mentioned, IoT, grid automation and drones, to analytics and augmented reality, intelligent automation. When we look at this, you know, all these are very exciting changes and challenges that require us to think differently than that traditional IT/OT structure. We're moving that IT/OT structure to terms of just technology, right? So it gives us an opportunity to shift from governance mindsets to really technology enablement mindsets. You know, so as these growth opportunities continue to present themselves, you know, things like remote enablement, machine learning embed themselves into our device, we have to refocus those efforts to add layers of security, but also embrace the mentalities of fail fast and trust but verify, because they have a growing, increasing importance. These are probably just a few of the reasons why having a passion around technology in the utility industry and then the people it impacts is so easy. So I mean, yeah, today, full discussions around R&D, way we approach things that we're doing. Just happy to have a conversation with y'all.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to pivot right back to Mike. I mean, I want to lean on, and I hope our audience today, both now and if you aren't able to, you know, watch it live, you know, rewind this and watch it. You know, Mike, your decades of experience working in the trenches, you know, working behind those places we drive by every day as citizens or residents and go, man, that's a lot of electricity going on there, or whatever it is. We need a substation or a transmission, you know, substation, what have you. How hard is it, Mike, to really articulate, now that you're out, that culture of a utility versus this technology savvy world that wants to apply a lot of its capability to a tried and true, very reliable network, but maybe not as resilient as it needs to be?
You know, it's a great question, Pete, and I've thought a lot about it over the years. I think that the single biggest difference with the utility industry, particularly electric utility industry, and all other industries, is that the product is created, transmitted, and consumed at nearly the speed of light. And so other opportunities that, let's say, a car manufacturer would have, well, we'll build some more trucks than what I think we're going to need, so we have some inventory. That's not possible in the electric utility industry. It literally happens at the speed of light. So that means that when problems occur, the utilities need sensors that can relay that information back as quickly as possible, decisions be made, and then important command controls go back out so that, you know, the utility can deliver on its mission, which is to provide safe, reliable, and cost-effective electricity. And you know, that mission is really not that much different than it was when Tesla and Westinghouse envisioned this huge network, you know, built on alternating current, as opposed to what Thomas Edison was it's doing with direct current. But what has changed over that time is the customer expectations of their utilities have just gone up. We all expect less outages. We expect cleaner energy being used with more and more renewable sources. We also expect that, I'll just say it, that our utility doesn't cause some sort of, disaster like what's happened out west. And so the expectations are rising. The states, the cities are all increasing their renewable energy goals, and it's really a new chapter for the electric utility industry, particularly on the distribution network side, which is where Matt focuses. That's where the real change is happening right now. And I mentioned it before, the industrial Internet of Things. What I'm talking about is sensors and smart devices being installed throughout the distribution network, and wireless communications is really the only cost-effective way to communicate with those. And that's where Anterix comes in. We've got a 900 megahertz spectrum that these networks can be built upon. So I think that's it. I mean, every other industry out there has the opportunity to store their product in some way or another, but electric utility industry, nope, speed of light. Something goes wrong, you got to know it, and you got to know it right now.
It's an always on kind of thing. It's not like, hey, I can go home for the night and it'll just stay run the course. And I think, Matt, going to you, you kind of broached the topic of engendering a culture where technology is really not the problem. It's an implementation of that. And I'm thinking of like the cyber physical security. If we could just jump right into that, cyber physical systems. For the audience, you might need to Google or Bing or search whatever you want, some of the acronyms we're going to use, but cyber physical systems, industrial control systems, that's a different type of an architecture than the internet as we know it. Can you speak to some of maybe, and this isn't to be a loaded question, but they're very different, but they're very similar. The bottom line is they have to learn to work together because they each have served a purpose for years. One's old, one's new. What is that sort of discussion that you have when I'm an innovative thinker, but I respect the old school way of, not in my backyard?
So I think in order to have that discussion, we can even talk a little bit more about the whole R&D thing, right? So when we look at R&D efforts, we really kind of look at it in just a couple of phases, right? So generally, we send out a form to a vendor that wants to have access to our network or wants to have a technical discussion, and we have them kind of fill out this form. This way, it allows us to get an initial review of kind of where they're at in that maturity, and that includes anything from innovation to technical capabilities to even your cyber physical security, right? Then if that goes well, we have an in-person or virtual meeting to kind of further that conversation and really start to challenge them on this technology and innovation thought process that they have. Because what we really want to make sure is that as we bring these new vendors in, and even vendors that are revamping their image, what are you guys really going to start to push yourself towards the future? Because I do fully believe that we're not going to have a one-size-fits-all thing. So, what works for Evergy as a utility isn't necessarily going to work for the next utility. So how do we take a core system like that and give it a little bit of augmentation that makes it the most meaningful for us as a utility? And then obviously we go into lab views and then field trials if it makes it to that, we're in production. But that entire chain, we're discussing cyber and physical security. So, talk about IIoT. Let's limit that discussion to sensors, so communicating faulted circuit indicators, line voltage sensors, things like that. Generally, that data is actionable, but also it's just situational awareness data, right? So we're not looking to interrupt necessary power flow with that, but we are making better educated decisions with it. But now you think of this as in a recloser, you got your physical security, so you have password management on the device, you have a locked box. When you start thinking about cybersecurity, you start looking at, all right, so this communications medium, and we leverage 4G LTE for a lot of these devices. What are we doing with APN and VPN tunnels? What kind of traffic are we allowing through that? And then once it gets back in a sort of data center, how do we aggregate that data to make sure? And take it internally too, right? We know every data path that our DSCADA system goes to, whether it's an outage management system, a GIS portfolio, an EAM application, enterprise asset management, sorry. But like we have to know that entire string of data and where it goes. And so everyone refers to security as an onion, and that's no different. So that the higher risk asset you have, the closer to the center of the onion it should be.
Yeah, I'm writing down a picture as you're talking, and I'm just going to pivot back to Mike here, because it's with two folks. It's kind of cool to get the perspective and riff off one another. And please, Mike, or Matt, if I'm about to do what I do, and that's interject my takeaway commentary, jump in. You mentioned reclosers, advanced metering. You referenced things that resonate with me, and that's that architecture of the physical that we see, how electricity moves, and the data, the volume, velocity, variety, veracity of data. There's not a problem with energy, sector, if you will, utilities creating it, but distilling it. Mike Brozek, looking at what's happened in our country with wildfires and floods and dams to critical infrastructure, but in the electricity sector, where are we in your mind, and what excites you, I should say, about the opportunity to leverage AI and machine learning and the industrial Internet of Things to start that distillation process so we can have the intelligence, be it actionable or applied, to save lives? I mean, are you on that, advocacy path, but how do you communicate to your naysayer colleagues who are like, again, I don't need any of that internet protocol, we're good? How do you address that conversation?
Well, Pete, with all of the cyber intrusions that have occurred in our society and really across the globe, people who are concerned about using some of this modern technology because it could in fact be hacked. I mean, that's a real threat, and it's something that, as Matt said, we really have to protect against it, and utilities have to take that extra caution whenever it could disrupt the flow of electricity. But let me go back and answer your question. So when we talk about this data, the thing that probably excites me the most is the opportunity for machine learning, artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call it, to take a role here. And I say that only because there's been so many other industries that have had success with this. And what these systems need is a tremendous amount of data in order to be able to spot patterns that humans wouldn't necessarily spot before, and really build upon that to give advice, instructions, opportunities to utility operators that they wouldn't otherwise have. And the fuel for that, like I said before, is the data, and that's exactly what's happening with these devices. These devices that are being deployed have a tremendous amount of data, measuring and storage capability, and that's really what these machine learning devices. Now, let me be the first to say, I am not ready to turn the electric grid over to the robots tomorrow, but I sure wouldn't mind having a really smart robotic type system saying, have you thought of this? Have you looked at that? Have you noticed that every Tuesday at a certain amount of time, this thing happens? So maybe there's a problem, you should go check into it. Drawing intelligence out of data through pattern recognition, through other sources that has been proven in other industries. And that's probably one of the things I'm the most excited about.
Well, I'm going to take a brief pause to think through, if somebody's listening to us, maybe this is a good point as we talk about the future and the modernization of grid, that we've said it a few times, that the cycle, the ecosystem of technology alone to accelerate grid modernization, and the Department of Energy is leading a lot of that effort, working with the Department of Homeland Security and National Science Foundation with its grant making, but we're really, as a all hands on deck, trying to create a much more resilient grid. The generation phase of it, be it hydroelectric dams, power plants, solar panels, wind turbines, the transmission and distribution, which is kind of that phase 2 for those of us at home wondering, where does it start? Well, you generate the power, and then you transmit and distribute it to the home. But these are the substations, the sensors, the wires, the poles, the things you see, like I said, when you're driving on that highway and saying, I wonder how that works, but I'm glad somebody's managing it. The interconnections, and then obviously it to your home, so when you flip a switch on, the power's there. that's pretty complex. And as we introduce new technology into that infrastructure so that it's smarter, you hear that a lot in the smart city, smart community. I work in this space. I think, again, there's the stuff you don't see, the stuff that you do see, as I just hopefully illustrated, and then how it all works. How do we make it resilient? How do we make it scalable and flexible? Those are the objectives of a grid that needs to be modernized. And, Matt, coming to you, and on the flip side of, nobody's here to throw stones, but we do have a grid that's 100+ years old, and it works. And some people have, if it ain't broke, why are we trying to fix it? Technology aside, I heard Mike mention, or it might have been you, forgive me, but process needs to be looked at, the people and the roles that they're in, and of course the intervention or the integration of decision support tools, I think, are really part of that triage or triangulation of where we're going. Can you speak to some of, that while things are working, things can be improved, and how a 21st century utility workforce needs to kind of, improve its skill set or, reskill itself? What are you seeing needs to be done?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll actually hit on this in probably just 3 quick parts. So, first, when you think about the workforces, we have 100-year-old, or, some are new, some are old, but average 100-year-old grid out there. And it's really about augmenting the way people interact with the assets and the data from that. We've had this discussion internally. You can't really talk about technology or analytics separate anymore. Right, so technology drives the data for analytics to occur, and the hope is that analytics feeds that back to tech and says, "Hey, we think this," and then we, as a tech group, we can take action on that analytical result and kind of give that to people to make it better in the field. And then you start looking at these field assets, and so the second part is the field assets is how do you run this hybrid model, right? So how do you take machine learning and artificial intelligence, and how do you put it in a capacitor control, integrate that with a 900 megahertz mesh network, and have a SCADA channel where it's actually taking some of those decision-making parameters locally and outside of your traditional, the capacitor, which turns on VAR or temperature settings, and actually make it integrate with, 3-phase voltage measurements and things along that line. And so, we talk about it a lot, is there's a lot of assets we have out there, and when you think about leveraging technology, it doesn't just mean new tech, it means old tech too. So we have a lot of really good stuff out there. So how do you take a capacitor station that is a smart controller for everything we're focusing on, and then give it a little bit of a boost with some new tech? This way we're not, from a customer standpoint, we're not reinvesting into a brand new capacitor station. We're augmenting it just a little bit so your dollar goes to where it really matters. And I think that's really what we do. And then we take all of that and give whatever we can to our field ops folks, and we listen. If a lineman or a troubleshooter says, man, it would be nice to have a color-coded map of what we're looking at for fault location analysis. And so we went in and created an internal application that within 30 seconds of one of our fault indicators going off, we use a Google Maps overlay to shoot that out to our field folks on our internal intranet, and we give them an option to see a color-coded line segment of the circuit. We can tell them where the most feasible location for fault is. And that happens internally because we want to make sure that we're giving our customers, which starts with our field folks, the best advantage to make our customers that are paying for their bills to get their power restored, or to even avoid having their power out in the first place.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean,
well, Matt, when I think back to the, oh, hold on, Pete, I was going to say, when I think back to the old days and the way that process worked then, prior, somebody called in, a lineman was dispatched, and they had to, what we call, walk down the circuit with the, and if it was the middle of the night, that was a flashlight, walking through backyards and, across bridges and everything else to try and find that out. And you think about the amount of actionable information that you can put in that field worker's hands just right away, that it really is pretty powerful. You used the word augmented. At some point, I'd like to hear you talk about some of the advances you guys have made in augmented reality for the workforce, because as we said, that a lot of the devices in this 100-year-old grid are still out there, but the instruction manuals or the repair manuals might have been lost to history by then. So at some point, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
I didn't mean to interrupt there, Mike. I was just kind of getting ready to say, well, Mike, Matt just said something, putting the devices, which by default will put the data into the hands of the worker. And the reason I bring up the 21st century utility workforce, right? In the government, where I spent 8 of my 25 years at the Department of Energy as the CTO, I was able to actually meet with folks who are those stewards of owning and operating that infrastructure when I visit labs, national laboratories. We'll get to that in a minute, Mike, and the work you're doing with your CRADA efforts and so forth, and also with the Renewable Lab. There are people that do fear for, oh my gosh, that's the computer machine taking over, when really it's not that. It's we want to reskill, or we want to retrain, or we want to recruit. And the federal government, we preach those R's because the workforce is spending $90 billion a year, should I say, the agencies on IT support and services. And your points, Matt, about, it's not rip and replace. It's, well, we bought something, maybe it has a capability we need to find out. But when you introduce that new technology, it's leverage it, right? Leverage an industrial control system. It's arguably purpose-built in some cases for a specific sector. So I think it's, again, the integrations, the convergence. I don't hear anybody in my world, in my walkabout, saying, IT is needed, OT's old school. It's the OT-IT integration, and they both need each other. They're symbiotic. So that resonated with me, and maybe that is a great pivot. We've used the word 3 or 4 times. Mike, spectrum, the thing that I think is the most critical of all infrastructure, obviously from a communication standpoint. Why is that so important? And in terms of, from a utility perspective, and what's it used for back in the day? And you've been mentioning the 900 megahertz. What's so compelling about it for utility operators?
Well, absolutely, Pete. Spectrum is an exciting topic, and it's a new topic. Let's go back, though, a little bit in the past. Utilities have long discovered the power and the benefits of building a private communications network. And I want everybody to think for a moment about their smartphone that we all have in our pockets. And when you don't have access to your wireless service provider or Wi-Fi or any other network services, your smartphone is not very smart, and it's just kind of a dumb device. And all of this new technology that's being deployed out there is really dependent on the communication systems, that both the control systems back at headquarters and then these field devices, that they can communicate back and forth. And I think too often communications has been taken for granted. Utilities have realized that having their own private networks, which have been primarily fiber and microwave and then some proprietary wireless type solutions prior to this, have been the way to go, because when you own it, you control it. You build the coverage where you need, the reliability, the resiliency you need, and now the new important thing is the cybersecurity controls that you need. Where private LTE comes in, I mentioned it before, this LTE standard that we all use every day on our smartphones. Where this comes in is utilities and other critical infrastructure providers now have the ability to deploy their own private LTE system. This is very similar to me saying that you have the ability to build a house somewhere. What do you need to build the house on? You need land, unless it's a boat, then you need water. But anyway, you need land to build your house on. And that's what wireless spectrum is. It's land. It is, or it's the equivalent of land in that space. Think about the radio in your car and the different channels that the different radio stations play on. And then when you get in that area where you can't quite hear one anymore, but you kind of hear the other, and you get some problems, that's called interference, radio interference. So this is all boiling down to, what does Anterix bring to the table? Anterix is the largest holder of the 900 megahertz spectrum in what's called Band 8 in the United States, which includes Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. And what we've worked with the FCC, and the FCC has decided to do and has issued new rules for this, is this spectrum is being repurposed so that broadband networks can be deployed on this spectrum throughout the United States. Now, the important part here is this is licensed spectrum. In other words, I mentioned before, whenever you have the interference from as you're kind of in between two radio stations that are both on 100.3, and we've all experienced that, so you know what I'm talking about. What we're talking about with licensed spectrum is there is no opportunity for interference. You have the exclusive right to use that band of spectrum. And that's the type of reliability and security that utilities will need. One of the great things about 900 megahertz spectrum is that it's in what we call low band. And that means that and then we're going to get physics here, so just be ready. That means that the waves travel much further than they do at some of the higher frequency bands. They also have greater in-building penetration because of the way it works. It's all physics, nobody can change it. And so at a low band opportunity that utilities now have to build on means fewer towers, more devices per towers. We're talking about lower total cost of ownership here to deploy these private networks. Commercial networks are built to serve millions or even, or hundreds of millions of users. A private LTE network, for example, for Matt's utility or any of the others, can be purposely built to serve just their devices. So the devices, how they can connect, how they communicate, what they're able to do, along with visibility of all network traffic on this private LTE network is now available and now in the hands of utilities to build these networks on. And the cybersecurity benefits are really superior on a private network because you do have that capability. You can see every data packet that's flowing on that network. Whereas if you're using some of the other options, either the technology doesn't support it, or maybe you're leasing a slice of a public carrier's network, and you just don't have that insight. You don't have that visibility to it. So we're super excited here at Anterix. These new changes are very recent from the FCC, and we're out there talking with utilities across the whole nation about this. We have land. It's sometimes called the beachfront property of wireless, and we're excited to work with utilities and help them build their private LTE networks on it.
No, great, very thorough, comprehensive response. And what I took from some of that is, if you're considering a private LTE network or leveraging a carrier, it's the buy versus build, and there's pros and cons. And I don't like to say cons. There's things you need to consider, and resilience. Having something private, people might think of as, ooh, that's what I want, and that could be your backup to a public network that you don't have to maintain, and you sign some service level agreement. In the federal IT space, there's this whole move to the cloud and let somebody else maintain the infrastructure, but I just still want to own my data, but I still want to have my data center, God forbid something happens in that domain that I couldn't control. So I think wearing your incredible Professor Mike hat, that was helpful, because low band, high band, physics and vernacular aside, this conversation is intended to educate, inform, and enlighten. So it's incumbent, I think, on the resident, the consumer, and Matt, you addressed this a bit earlier, we'll pivot to you, is the consumers become a part of this discussion. Our bills look differently, at least mine do up in the Northeast. The data consumption, they're giving me data, I guess, because of a smart meter I have, and being able to make decisions versus just paying a bill tells me, wow, that's an exemplar of, hey, I can make decisions or have choice. Is it renewable power when it's generated versus fossil? So I embrace that, me personally being a kind of tech guy, that more data means more opportunity to be involved in decisions for myself and my family, and from a business perspective as well. Matt, let's go back to you here. The grid modernization, you're out there, you have great quotes. You guys and gals, make sure you search Matt Bult. He has some awesome tweets, but he's sought after a lot for this art of the possible. And I think of words distributed energy and 5G, and we've been talking about broadband and mission criticality. How important, Matt, if you can convey an illustrative example yet again for our audience about why a network needs to be adaptable, because sometimes it's, yes, bad things will happen and there are outages, but how less adaptable are we today versus what you've seen with the future and that art of the future can look at? Give folks a perspective of, it is really time to upgrade the power grid.
Absolutely. So I mean, we've had this discussion internally, right? So we do the more of the leased lines, 4G. We go to a carrier, we get the SLAs going, and that's how we leverage it right now. And I think the beautiful thing about the grid and back to my previous comment about leveraging, new and old technology is that, if we run out of comms, yeah, can we not run one of our automation schemes? Probably. But at the end of the day, a capacitor is still going to switch on for temperature and VAR control. A voltage regulator is still going to make a step based upon a set point change, right? So we are fortunate enough in our industry where if it really hits the fan, we're kind of covered because these devices still kind of run in their natural state. But that doesn't mean comms isn't important, and it's crucial. And so when we look at kind of setting up the architecture for communication, there are different levels of that, right? So, the more critical devices need to be definitely focused on real-time comms, and we've had this discussion with a lot of providers out there from a cellular and an application standpoint. At the end of the day, I can't make a database better than usually how it comes out of the box, right? So some of these natural actions, when an operator goes to click close on a recloser, there's an expectation because what they're used to is how quick their phone reacts. So everyone's conditioned to the way current state technology works, and then that doesn't change when they go sit behind a computer. And so we have got to make sure that we are managing the entire latency profile from application to database to decision making to communications, and likely communication is the best place to focus on that. So, things like reclosers and regulators and partially caps have a very strong preference for a low latency network like fiber, Ethernet, and cell. Whereas, sensors and some other versions of capacitors could leverage more of a mesh network type. We need as a utility to be cognizant of that and kind of challenge ourselves to make sure that we're really doing what's best in class for each one of those assets, instead of just saying, well, we've invested in this, now it's time to go make sure that we leverage it to the fullest extent, which granted, that's part of the business case when you do these new investments, is making sure that we can actually capture that return on investment. But it's also about making sure that you right size it for the application. And I think that's kind of where we're going. And so a lot of the communication discussions and architecture is about, what can we do? And, mesh network's a great example. Pete, I think you mentioned smart cities. That whole conversation of what we can do with the mesh network is purely about enablement. From a utility standpoint, we have our AMI network. We have all of our 1.6 million meters talking over our mesh network. But how can we take something like that and then allow our communities to leverage it in a whole nother stance? And again, that kind of goes back to that security and layer of onions, right? Our layer in the onion is, if we're going to leverage it for that side, how do we manage our risk with all the assets that may or may not integrate to that?
Yeah, let me comment on that. And Mike, I'm going to come up to you here because I'm going to bring the government role into this. You've had the opportunity to lead efforts in the national laboratory ecosystem. And again, our audience, little background: the national laboratories, treasure troves in our country, national labs governed by the Department of Energy, but leveraged internationally, worldwide, been around for decades. When I think of the R&D component of a modernizing of grid effort, if there's anyone listening want to write down, take a good read of the Worldwide Threat Assessment of the U.S. Intelligence Community 2019 report. I think it's page 4 or 5. I remember chatting with Bruce Walker at the Department of Energy saying page 4 or 5, it says it right there, the risk of cyber security. And I'll quote the phrase that caught my attention was, as we connect and integrate billions of new digital devices into our lives and business processes, adversaries and strategic competitors almost certainly will gain greater insight into and access to our protected information, human, individual, business. You mentioned risk, Matt. Mike, when you were out at the National Renewable Energy Lab, the work you're doing with the University of Maryland and the team of folks on securing the industrial Internet of Things, you and I have talked about the prevention of high consequence events, the mitigation of mid-range events, the acceptance of low consequence events. That's your point, Matt Bult, about certain devices are much more relevant and either protect or could create a risk reaction that we have to pay attention to. How do you see the government and your activities, Mike, opening your eyes to an opportunity to work with the government and industry to bring together a much more secure, resilient grid with a lot of what we have talked about over the years?
Well, I'm going to talk about, the two engagements that we've had. And the first one, the one that's been going on a little bit longer, is with the National Renewable Energy Lab. The first thing that impresses me most about these national labs is their vision, their ability to look down the road and see problems that we're not currently experiencing, but that we know are coming. So I mentioned before, renewable energy goals that states and cities and others are putting in front of utilities they have to meet. Most of those are being met through for the deployment of renewables. And most of the wind energy is in large wind farms that it's really being dispatched and managed very similar to a large other generating facility, be it coal or nuclear or whatever. But when it comes to solar, solar is being deployed in all sizes and shapes. There's community solar farms, there's utility grade solar farms that are huge, and then there's solar panels that are going on your house. I mentioned, that we've said it several times, the 100-plus-year-old grid was designed, once energy hit that distribution network, the flow of power was one direction. It went from the substation to your house. But now, when you have solar panels on your roof, now suddenly you become what's called a prosumer. You're both a producer and a consumer of the energy, because the sun doesn't shine all the time. Sometimes pesky clouds come over, that sort of thing. But now it's changed. And we'll layer on top of that now the slow but steady increase in electric vehicles. And so you have, and anybody can go out there and Google this term, the duck curve. You have the duck curve problem, which is as more and more energy is being produced by solar panels out in the residential space, at the exact same time that the sun begins to go down and those panels produce less electricity, people will be coming home and plugging their electric vehicles in. So utility has always had a challenge of measuring voltage and managing it that used to stop at the substation level. Now it's got to go all the way out through the distribution network. And for the first time, the consumers have the ability to make decisions that is going to change the electrical characteristics of their network. Now, that all sounds like science fiction, some future thing, and we're going to have flying cars and all this other stuff, but it's not, it's real. And, when and I don't know, Matt, you might know the number, but I would say whenever the amount of customers on a typical distribution circuit that have solar panels reaches anywhere past 30-35%, you've got a real problem on your hands, and you've got to be able to manage that. And that's what the National Renewable Energy Lab is already looking into, and they're already working on how are we going to be able to dispatch, because what's going to happen is if we don't need the power from your solar panels because it might drive the voltage up too high, the utility's going to have the ability to interact with that. And so our project there, what we helped show was with the private LTE network, you can deploy some features called quality of service to make sure that that very important message gets through while other less important traffic gets through. Most of the utilities we've been working with are looking at collapsing a lot of wireless networks and bringing new devices onto this. But not every device, as we said before, is the same priority, and not every message is the same priority every time. So you just have this great capability with private LTE to be able to ensure that that signal gets through regardless of the wireless congestion or even poor coverage areas. Okay, now I'm going to pivot to the project we're working with NIST and the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. Here we're talking about the industrial Internet of Things. And those of you who know anything about NIST know that there's true thought leaders in our country and will often come forward with recommendations, sometimes even standards on how things should be done. And that's what this project is involved in, is the industrial Internet of Things. We're talking about not just specific to the utility sector, although that'll be a main focus point for us, but we're working on being able to produce recommendations on how these things should be properly secured, so that in the world of cybersecurity, there's this term used called the threat landscape, and every time you deploy a computer of any kind, you've just increased your target area. And so you've got to be sure that you apply the right layers of security to make sure that, that things like what happened in the Ukraine don't happen here. So that's another one that people can go out and Google.
Yeah, well done in terms of just giving a picture of public-private partnership in this case, where government, you mentioned NIST, and again, coming down here to Matt, the question, Matt, that's going to be for you is, this engagement, this partnership in a utility with Uncle Sam, with other, competitors, but we're all part of one network, right? There's no one utility that just cares about itself. You're as strong as your weakest link. You're as resilient as your weakest link. I want to compound having, from a government perspective, that the powerful nature of a cooperative research and development agreement. Big shout out to Jim McCarthy, who was on our last Industry Insight. What he's doing and leading efforts to bridge those communities is pretty amazing. From the standpoint of frameworks and assessments, which was used earlier, it's framework soup. There's the cybersecurity framework. There's the cybersecurity capability maturity model. There are taxonomy after taxonomies, homegrown, universally accepted. There's no shortage of resources, right, Matt? You could say it's time to roadmap our future. Where do we start? Well, I guess that's a question for those that are in motion doing it. But how do you engage a utility, that world, be it a tech company, be it a service provider, or even the government, to say, look, we're in this together? I know you personally as one who's very collaborative and is engaging, but what is that sentiment, and how does it work at Evergy? Because your mission statement and what you all stand for, it preaches a lot of the open government tenets of collaborative, participatory transparency, because it's for a greater good, right? The power grid supports a greater good, life. Comments?
Absolutely. So before I hit there, I think what's really important is to set yourself up for that, right? So hitting on a high level, you have adaptable architecture in your data gate models, which is probably a different way of saying your service bus. So an adaptable architecture is really wanting to make sure that you get the best in class and not just the best module software package you get. And so things like adaptable architecture really allow us to be lenient about the technology that we look at. So, if you buy these big box systems and yet vendor X or technology company Y come in and say, hey man, we'd really love to do this, you're going to be like, oh, sorry, we can't, because we have this big box solution that doesn't allow us to even consider integrating that to it. But if you approach it from an adaptable standpoint, you say, you know what, like full VAR optimization, and a D-SCADA engine might be really good, but its Bult VAR optimization engine and the way it architects that data in the database may not be efficient. But what if we get the D-SCADA engine that's the best in industry, and then go to vendor X and go get their VVO component, because that's the best in industry for that. And then we just marry those things through integration. So that's the same thing with data gate models, right? You look at traditional SCADA systems, a recloser has over 500 data points. To Mike's point about prioritizing data sets, there's really three classes we look at: what's operational, what's engineering and situational awareness, and then what is considered asset management points, right? And so that data gate model, we classify the data and you bring it into the data gate. Well, those 500 data points don't need to all go to SCADA. Majority of those are just going to be historized, right? So, 30 assets 30 data points need to be within our SCADA landscape. And so operators are actually integrating with those. This way, we're not bogging down our SCADA systems with this excess data sets. But all that supports this R&D effort, and we're doing that across the board, right? So we're reaching out to universities, we're reaching out to companies. I kind of talked about what we did at R&D a little earlier, and I want to say that we probably engage with 5 to 10 companies every couple of months that are bringing something. And sometimes it's just we have a branch of our company, Evergy Ventures, which is that kind of looking out for that forward investment strategy, but a lot of that's tech. So we're seeing that shift naturally occur in tech. And as a utility, what's key is making sure we maintain the energy value chain, right? So whatever we look to invest in, engage in, has to represent the energy value chain at some level. So yeah, we've kind of created our system to do that, to bring people in, to have these technical conversations, and they're very blunt and honest. If there are gaps in the technology being brought forth, we're very forward about what those gaps are. And we've had companies that have taken a year off and then come back to us and said, hey, those 10 things y'all listed, we fixed them. Can we go now? And then, man, we kick off a pilot.
Well, oh, that's cool. That sounds very much intriguing if I'm somebody saying, look, I don't want to sell you snake oil. I want to show you. I did a recent webinar where it was, don't tell me, show me. Do you offer that? And Mike, your experiences too, like sandboxing, pilots, proofs of concept. There is a feeling, and I think it's fair, that some businesses are like, not in my backyard, but hey, we got it. But being open to, that's very myopic, right? But open to come in and show me. Do you offer that to industry and to tech providers?
From our standpoint at Evergy, absolutely. So we, like I said, we bring folks in, we have them fill out a form that we review, and if they make it past that, bring them in and have a very, like I said, blunt technical discussion, give them the reasons why or why not we want to move forward. But yeah, I think we have four or five different proof of concepts going on right now. Anything from battery storage to we're kicking off something around IoT. We're doing to mention the adaptable framework, partnering with Utilidata to understand how you can do server-based VVO without having a big ADMS architecture. So we're doing a lot of these things to try to get out there and understand where the tech companies are taking it, and from a utility standpoint, how we maintain that ability to move and migrate to those more, maybe even cost-effective methods.
Yeah, and Pete, from an Anterix standpoint, we are happy to work with utilities or other critical infrastructure providers who want to do pilots, and we've done a number of pilots, throughout the country. And in my 3 decades at the utility, it was like we were all from Missouri, the show me state. You come in, you give a presentation, you talk about this, you write stuff on a whiteboard, and we'd say, so what? I want to see this thing work. And so, that's what being in a 100-year-old industry does. They've been around the block multiple times, and they want to see this stuff actually work. And we are very excited and relish the opportunity to be able to do a pilot with utility, whether it be in a lab type setting or in full production. And there's a number of them. People can go to our website and see some of the entities out there that have filed experimental licenses, and that we're working with them on pilots for it. So.
Yeah, no, this is great. I know we're coming up on our hour, and I want to save a little bit of time for a parting shot, and that maybe as I'm chatting through this, you guys can start getting those, as I like to say, neurons firing, because I think that the partnership component, that's the ecosystem. It's industry, right? It's the operators. Heck, it's even in the business. And maybe that's my before parting shot question quickly to you, Matt, since you're living it. The culture of a utility, there's the C-suite, there's the middle management, and then there's the dudes and the dudettes that are keeping the lights on, right? The folks in the field. I know you're not speaking for Evergy, and if you want, fine, but is there a dynamic there that where you have, just like in government, places where it's, yes, I want to fail fast, I want to try new things, and then there's people that are like, hey, we don't have the funding to support that vision, and we're the ones that are going to be called out if there's a breach. I mean, how much of the culture of a utility outside of tech is necessary to, change and morph and think about transformation, in the culture and have voices heard?
I think it's honestly really simple. It's trust. If you don't have the relationships around trust, it's going to be awful difficult. So, I mean, for instance, myself and our CTO, or Chief Technology Officer, we lead an internal committee called Leveraging Technology. And it is about technology incubation and how do we get things. And I mean, we've had four initiatives come out of that. IIoT, our UAS development. It started in ops, but then grew into this leverage technology. RPA, digital workspace. We're using that kind of platform to bring this whole cross-functional group together and say, we're going to do this. We're really going to leverage technology together. And like I said, we have people from safety, risk, legal, ops, our IT departments, everywhere, and we come together every other week, talk tech, and see about things we're going to look on to next, including augmented reality, which is one of our newest defined initiatives.
I think we need to dispel that myth for good and get you inside the Beltway, which we will, and talk about that, because that's a human component of the tech humanity culture that I know Mike, you and I've talked for hours about. Mike, what about you? Did you experience that? Or, I don't think every organization's that way. And how do you break down that wall of, like, have a vision, but talk to us too. Talk to us down there who have to maintain.
Right. It's a challenge in every industry, and I think in every company, and like Matt said, it's based on trust, and and relationships are built on trust, and that's really what you have to look for. And I applaud you, Matt, for having a regular interaction with those folks so that you can build those relationships and help build that sense of trust. Pete, I don't know if we're ready for our parting shots yet.
We are, buddy. Take away. You get 1 minute. I'm timing.
So my message and my parting shot to any of the utilities or critical infrastructure providers out there who might be considering private LTE is this: you are not alone. There is an organization that has been formed called the Utility Broadband Alliance. Anterix is a member, Evergy is a member, Dots and Bridges is a member. There's tons of other members out there. This is an organization that is by utilities and for utilities, and also with critical vendors that can help them out. And you can sit there and listen to companies like Southern Company and see what they've done as they've deployed private LTE networks throughout their service territory. You can talk with Ameren and see what they're getting ready to do on 900 megahertz. You are not alone. You have friends that you can talk to and get really great advice on this. And I'll leave it there.
Oh, fantastic. UBBA. And again, I hope after this, for those of you registered, we'll send out to our registrants links to some of these resources. Awesome, Mike. Matt, parting shot.
Yeah, so just referencing how I started, I think having a passion in the utility sector is easy because of our potential for growth is high, and the service we provide, I think, like we've all talked about, is essential to almost every function of our modern world. This doesn't mean people are not going to see technology in different stages. It means that in order for us to change, we have to find a balance between respect and raising the heat enough to enact the change that's needed. I know those words sound easy, so I think it's just fair to say that whatever approach to leveraging technology you choose to do, the technology is likely going to be the easiest.
Well said.
Yeah, well said. And I think to two storytellers and to our audience, facts tell, stories tell is something I like to emphasize. The 4 examples that each of you shared today was phenomenal. And again, my parting shot, and I always love these types of dialogue environments, because what I took away is, as complex as our grid is, and as much as we're trying to balance the old and the new and the to be and the as is, and how do we get there, heterogeneous connectivity is something that just accept it. It's not going to be an IT grid and once was an OT grid. I think this interdisciplinary approach to brilliant minds like yourselves, your collaborative nature, it takes folks that have your DNA like yourself to help bridge that gap, because it's okay to be a late adopter and an early adopter, but we've got to come together, and trust is the word that's going to resonate. So I thank you, Mike Brozek. Keep doing the wonderful things you're doing. Matt Bult, your passion's infectious. Probably not a word I should use right now in a case of the new normal, but I've absorbed it. Thank you to Anterix, Martarez, Ryan Gerbrand, and the folks that helped pull this together, Anthony. So, until we meet again, I hope today was an educational, enlightening, and informing day.